Hey, hi, greetings, hello, yes, welcome, salutations. My name is Chris, and I am the resident nerd of this channel, and today we are playing more Kerbal Space Program. Last episode we left off, we had just gotten into orbit around Dres, and now we still have a very eccentric orbit, which means that we're very high above Dres now, and that's the perfect place to deploy all of our satellites. This is the Xeno. It is our main communication satellite. It has the big antenna, which means that it can communicate back to Kerbin, and it's just getting into a really big orbit that I'm going to have to adjust later, but I haven't figured that out yet. And this is the Protagoras 1. Oh wait, no, this is... sorry. This is the extra bit that I used to dock the Xeno to the Parmenides, and I'm just disposing of that. This is the Protagoras 1 that is being deployed right now, and it has a much smaller communications antenna. This is intended just for local communications in the Dres system, so that the probes can all talk to each other. This is the one that isn't totally broken, and it is deploying into an orbit in the opposite direction, but it's an equally large orbit, and it's equally going to need adjustment because I don't actually know how comnets work in this game yet. This is the Protagoras 2, and this one only has one antenna because the other one broke for some reason, but it's okay, it works, everything is fine. It just looks a little weird. And here we have the Anaximander. This is our resource scanning satellite, and we need it to do a resource scan so we can get all the science. And we're deploying it here because that is the easiest place to insert it into a polar orbit, which is what you need to do a resource scan. But speaking of getting all the science, we're going to do a little bit of sciencing right now. We're going to start our research lab researching, and we're going to gather some experiments that we can process in our lab. And once we've done that, we're going to get out Dilbo Kerman, which is this guy, and he's going to reset those experiments so that our landers work the way we expect them to. And then we're going to run those experiments again, and we're just going to keep them and store them because processing them in the lab actually deletes them, which is good. It means that the game is not broken anymore. And then Dilbo, after we run all those experiments again, Dilbo is going to have to get back out and collect them so that they're not taking up space, and also reset everything again. And that's what we're doing now. I guess he doesn't have to reset anything again because I'm smart and did it all the first time. That's why I did the science experiment twice. I know what I'm doing. I'm totally convincing when I say that. Yeah. But now we are ready to deploy the Philolaus, which is our gravity scanning satellite. The gravity scan experiment in Kerbal Space Program is one of the few experiments that actually yields different results per biome in space. And not only does it do it in space, but it does it in space in low orbit, and in space high above the surface, which means that we need this thing to basically go around the entire planet at high altitude and at low altitude and collect gravity scans, which is why we have this probe and why we're putting it into a polar orbit, because polar orbits go over all the biomes, and it's great. You'll see the polar orbit in a little bit, but first we are going to transfer some crew. We get Saito Kerman and Jebediah Kerman. Jeb is our pilot and Saito is an engineer in case we break the landing legs. And they are transferring into the Heraclitus, which is our small lander, and it is deploying, and it is going to have to make its first landing at the poles. That is what we are going to set up now. Basically, at this point is the efficient point to get into a polar orbit, so we might as well do it now, and that's why we have that little extra fuel tank at the top. I mentioned that in the first episode, and how that would play in later. Basically, that gives us just the extra fuel we need in order to circularize our orbit from this huge orbit, and then later to land and lift off, and then re-extend our orbit and make the plane change in order to rendezvous back with the Parmenides. But you'll see all that later. For now, we just have this extended bit with the Philolaus. We are in space very high over Dres, and basically Dres is rotating underneath us because we're barely moving. As you can see, we're going 2.7 meters per second at the bottom of the screen there. Basically, we're standing still and Dres is spinning below us, which means we're passing over all the biomes that we need to pass over for our science experiment, which means that I just take a very long time trying to get all of them. And I get about 6 of them. I think I'd get to 6 of them. And then it takes me about 30 minutes, half an hour, something like that. Maybe it takes me longer. I don't remember. It took me at least like 3 full Dres days of time warping, because there's one biome that's only in like one specific place. It's the canyons, and I finally figured out how to get to it. I figured out the rotational period, and I've got it. And here we are gathering the gravity scan while in space high over Dres's canyons and storing it. And now we have 7 out of the 8 gravity scans for the 8 biomes we need. And the last one is just the poles, and we're gonna just zoom in and grab that. And that's what we're doing now. We're time warping. And as we're time warping, I'm realizing that we're losing signal strength, which means that we're not able to communicate with our probes, which is not what I expected, because I have all these communication satellites and they're not working. So I realize I need to get them much closer. So all of them, I decelerate them so that they will swing, instead of being in super high orbits around Dres, they will swing by much closer. Unfortunately, that's going to take a while, which means that it's sort of a precarious position for my probes the whole time they're traveling. But the first thing to arrive at Dres is the Heraclitus, which is here, and we're getting a quick gravity scan in space high over the poles from the Heraclitus. The Heraclitus also has the gravity scan experiment because it needs to do it on the surface, and the Laos can't do it on the surface. But here we are, just burning our engine to insert into a low polar orbit around Dres. And from this point, we will be able to land at the poles pretty trivially, but we'll do that in a little bit. For now, we just need to make sure all of our probes get safely into orbit. And we have a problem, because as you're supposed to burn at periapsis, which is the ideal place to burn, but since we have our communication problem, we're not in communications range at periaps, which means that the Anaximander has to burn past periaps, which is slightly more inefficient. But it's fine. We can still lower our orbit to the altitude that we need in order to perform a survey. We just have to be a little creative with our burn, and here I am adjusting the angle at which I fire my engine, just sort of trial and error to figure out which way I need to burn in order to adjust the periaps and apoaps to be within the range. And then I find out the disappointing part. I try to perform an orbital survey, and I discover there are no usable in-range comms devices on this vessel. The probe can communicate because all of the probe bodies have a communications antenna, but to transmit science, you need a special antenna, and I forgot to include one in the design stage because I'm an idiot. So we will not be able to get all of the science from Dres. I think we're going to lose like 25 science points. But that's not so bad. Anyway, what we're doing now is we have to change the orbit of the Parmenides, our mothership, and that means that we have to move the Parmenides. We have to fire its engines. But unfortunately, one of the big landers on the Parmenides is out because the Heraclitus, because it is in orbit, and we are trying to land it, which means we have to rearrange the other vessels that are docked with the Parmenides in order to balance the mass, the weight payload. And that sort of takes a while because this thing has a grappling hook instead of a docking port. But we got it, and we are now ready to fire our engines. We're going to fire them lightly at first, and then that turns out not to do a whole lot, so I fire them up a little. I turn them up a little more, throttle up, and then I'm going to throttle up a third time because I'm really just sort of winging it. I don't intend to fully circularize, but I don't have any reason why I stop where I stop. But you will see later that it turns out that it will be actually a very good idea not to fully circularize. And here I am about to finally cut it off at about 36,000 kilometers. Anyway, here is the Philolaus, and we're getting that final gravity scan over the poles, high over the poles, before we try to circularize into a lower orbit, and we're warping to the periapsis in order to circularize, but we have the same communications problem where we can't communicate with anyone because Dres is in the way. So once we can communicate with someone, right about now, we have to do the same sort of finagling to try to lower our orbit, firing at off angles from prograde and retrograde. But it's fine. This thing has a ton of fuel because it's so tiny. And we've lowered our orbit from one that takes 60 days to one that takes about an hour and a half, which means that we can just come back around the planet. And when we come back around, because we put the Parmenides into a lower orbit, we are actually in communications range, which means we can operate our probe at periaps like we're supposed to. It's all like I know what I'm doing. And so we're grabbing some quick gravity scans. We got the lowlands, and now we're about to pass into the ridges and grab the scan from the ridges in space low. And then we are firing our engines a little bit to lower our apoaps in order to get us into a 15-kilometer orbit, which is our end goal. And once we get there, we just have to go around the planet a lot and collect a bunch of gravity scans from all the biomes. That'll take a while. It's actually going to take even longer because we're going to be in and out of communications range until our other satellites get down here. But while we do this, I should talk a bit, I guess, about Philolaus, the Greek pre-Socratic philosopher for whom this probe is named. He was an early follower of Pythagoras, and he developed one of the first non-geocentric cosmological systems, meaning that Earth orbited something else rather than everything else orbiting the Earth, which is really neat. He also had a system of categorizing, existence, which was kind of what the pre-Socratics were really into. He believed everything was created out of a combination between the unlimited as an abstract, the unlimitedness, and then just the idea of limit, and that everything started out essentially as the great unlimited, and then limit came in, and that's how you have the things that exist today, which is kind of neat, if a bit, vague. For how long ago it was, it seems pretty legit compared to a lot of other theories of existence. But at this point, I decide that we have most of the biomes, and to get the last one or two biomes we need without a full communications network is just going to be tedious and annoying. So I decide to leave the Philolaus alone, and in the next episode we will be descending to the surface and making our first landing and putting the first footprints on the surface of Dres. Until then, stay tuned. I should have some sort of a sign out. Also, the engine should fire now. There we go.